Hello, my name's Jay Shooster. I'm an effective altruist and an animal rights lawyer. And today I'm going to be talking about animal welfare and consumer protection litigation. And for me, what I focus on as an attorney is basically suing companies that are claiming to be humane, natural, sustainable, and making other kind of ethical claims about their production processes. And that basically there are two types of cases that I focus on. The first is class actions. That's probably what you might think of when you think of a false advertising case. So that's where consumers have purchased a product and you sue on behalf of a consumer who basically is alleging that they were misled. So the company said their products were humane, and now I've been harmed because I purchased the product relying on that representation, and I should be compensated for basically being lied to. And the other type of case is what we call consumer watchdog action on behalf of a nonprofit group. And that's where we're not just seeking damages on behalf of consumers who bought the product. We're really only seeking injunctive relief, and that would be a court order to force the company to stop deceiving consumers, to basically get rid of the misleading ads. And in our practice, we build our false advertising cases around what we call a trifecta approach. Previously, that meant focusing on environmental claims, animal welfare claims, and public health claims. But recently, we realized the trifecta was really missing an extremely important ethical issue and an urgent one more than ever amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is labor rights claims as well. And the theory behind addressing these issues in tandem, which we think are all really catastrophic harms perpetrated by the meat industry across these domains, the thinking there is that even if your judge or media outlet or consumer doesn't necessarily care about any one of these issues in isolation, collectively they can appreciate the interrelated nature of these issues, or at a minimum they may care about one of these issues, even if they don't care about all of them. And if you know about anything about any of these fields, you probably have some sense that the substantive laws and regulation actually governing the production practices with respect to these various dimensions are extremely weak. And this is probably true most of all for farm animals, where the laws governing their treatment are either non-existent or completely unenforced in the few places where they do exist. And the great thing about this type of work is that even when we can't hold a company directly accountable for violating an animal welfare law, we can still hold them accountable for lying about abusing animals. And so that's really the theory of this work in a nutshell, is that even when the substantive laws and regulations might be weak, when companies lie to consumers and try to con them into believing that their products are great for the environment or great for animals, we really do have the ability to hold them accountable through false advertising litigation. And one of the really exciting aspects of this work, as I always describe it, is that these cases become undercover investigations on steroids. We don't just investigate a farm or a slaughterhouse, we investigate the boardroom. And what that means for us is that we can demonstrate to the court and beyond that standard business practices and systemic harms are ratified by the highest levels of America's largest meat companies. And basically show that, contrary to the company's response every time there's a new PETA video or video from an animal rights group, is that it's not just a matter of bad apples violating protocol. We can literally show the guidelines, the documents that outline here's how you mutilate and rip out a piglet's testicles from their body, and here's the form from the company that instructs their employees how to do that. And we can even get the leading animal welfare expert at a company to get on record saying these are our practices that we engage in, and these have been ratified by the highest levels of the company. And for us, that's really crucial. And for me, as an effective altruist, I think it's a really crucial and neglected part of our work as a movement, which is really to expose that in a concrete and systematic way that the media and the public and the courts can understand that the industry is really rotten to its core. And we don't just do that with America's biggest meat companies. We can also do that with companies that are sold in places like Whole Foods to really drive home that this whole enterprise of animal agriculture, whether it's the biggest factory farms or even more niche brands, is really built upon extreme cruelty to animals, and this entire industry needs to go. And here's some of the organizational partners we work with. You can see there's a lot of animal rights groups. I'll mention the Animal Legal Defense Fund is really, aside from Richmond Law Group, the group that does the most work in this area of false advertising litigation. And then we also work with environmental focus groups like Food and Water Watch and groups like the Organic Consumers Association, which are more focused on human health and consumer rights. And here's an example of some, I think, really excellent media coverage that shows the power of these cases and also highlights some of the targets that we pursued in these cases. So you may have heard of Tyson, I'm sure, but also Hormel's, one of the world's largest meat companies. And then other brands like Ben and Jerry's, as I was saying before, brands we try to also focus on brands that are perceived by people to be better and good, to really expose just how systematically cruel this industry is across the board, and to try to destroy this humane myth that exists that people like to believe that the products they're getting are special and okay. And yeah, so we've also pursued cases against companies like Pilgrim's Pride and Sanderson Farms, which with Tyson Foods make up the three largest chicken companies in the United States. Now I want to show you just some examples of the types of ads that we might pursue through a lawsuit. And this, in fact, is an ad that is at the core of our litigation against Tyson Foods right now. You can see here it says things like, "We're committed to offering consumers the most humanely raised food possible," which we will point out in the litigation that Tyson has actually argued against companies that use the same animal welfare standards that it uses, and has argued saying they shouldn't be allowed to call their food humane or humanely raised because it leads people to believe that they would exceed industry standards. And yet, here is Tyson doing the same thing. And I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just written words that we would pursue in these cases. It can also be pictures, imagery of, for example, chickens out on grass. But some other popular words that we would pursue in these type of cases, misleading representations, would be things like pasture raised, the safest products, all natural, naturally raised, wild caught, sustainable, sustainably farmed, safe working environment, hand-fed, free to roam, free run, and I could keep going with all of the crazy terms that the industry is using to mislead consumers. And those are actually all real terms that are either at the core of our current litigation or cases that we are on the cusp of filing. And here's another example just to show, we can also go after everything from, websites to YouTube videos, social media, Facebook, Twitter, television advertisements, labels on products, although it gets a little complicated when we talk about product labeling, and that's a whole other conversation worth having. I'm not going to get into now. And I also want to point out that, going back to claims like the most humanely raised food possible, these type of superlative or comparative claims are especially likely to lend themselves to a successful lawsuit where, it's very concrete. It's not just a statement, a general statement that we are humane. It's actually saying we are most humane or more humane. And these are things where you can compare different companies' practices and say, there, on no dimension does this company, exceed the standard industry practices, and that could be a very powerful argument. Companies, though, of course, will often try to use what they think are clever caveats, like "we are committed to," or "we are striving to be humane," or "we believe in humane treatment." But that is not necessarily going to protect them, because the key question in these cases is, what does a reasonable consumer think when they're exposed to these ads? And of course, that's not necessarily a science, but we can effectively show through consumer perception surveys, both ones that just exist in the public domain and ones that we will commission ourselves for litigation, to show that actually, yeah, huge numbers of consumers actually do take away meaningful messages from these types of ads, even when they do contain these types of qualifiers like committed to. And there have been several positive legal decisions where courts have basically held you can't just slap on the words committed to and then say whatever you want. It doesn't give you a license to mislead consumers. Because the question is not what does a savvy lawyer think this means, it's what does a reasonable person in the grocery store think. And now I'll just talk about what we can actually get in these cases. What is the relief, the actual outcome, best case scenario? And it's a bit complicated because we can't force these companies to completely change their business practices and, let's just say, become humane and put all their chickens out on pasture. We can't compel them to do that, even if we win the case. What we can do, and what a court would be willing to do, is to force the company to stop lying about the conditions. So they would have to take down the misleading ads, or potentially even put up a corrective advertisement, basically informing consumers, we said that our chickens went outside, but they actually don't go outside. But even though we can't force a company to change their business practices, the leverage, we have a lot of leverage in these cases, because these companies, the last thing in the world that they want is a court order saying basically they're not humane and therefore they need to remove any advertisements that say they are humane. That would just be extremely incriminating for the company. And so what these companies, what they do is they're willing to negotiate in certain circumstances, not all of them, to actually improve their business practices, even though they wouldn't technically be ordered to by the court, just because their brands really matter to them. It really matters to these companies to be able to hold themselves out as humane and sustainable. This is, more than ever, you can look at any industry journal, and this is extremely viewed as being essential for all companies now. And so we actually are willing to, we do see companies that are willing to actually improve their production practices. And one example is a company that we sued that was marketing their eggs as being pasture raised. And ultimately, we learned that they were including eggs from caged egg farms in their pasture-raised products. And so, what we were able to do is work with the company to set up a binding, commitment to get third-party auditing of their supply chain to ensure going forward that all of the eggs actually genuinely are pasture-raised. And as another example, we recently initiated a dialogue with a company that has fish products that they market as humane, and we've been able to start a dialogue between them and a major animal rights group to have a conversation about how they can actually identify more humane suppliers of fish and expand their sourcing from companies that use the most humane methods that are commercially available. And the other key form of relief that we can get from these cases is attorney's fees. And that's really exciting to me as an effective altruist, because what it means is that we can actually get paid by the industry to do this work. We don't necessarily need to rely solely on donor dollars to be able to hold this industry accountable. The false advertising statutes we use in our cases are designed to incentivize people to come out of the woodwork and to protect consumers. And so, what we can do is negotiate for substantial monetary compensation for our work. Basically, the courts say, you should have to pay for all this group's trouble having to go out of their way to force you to comply with the law. And so that can be really huge. And I'm really excited to say that recently we recently passed the threshold where we have now taken more money from the industry through this work than we have actually committed from donor dollars from animal advocates. And so I really do think that this work can be financially sustainable in the future and beyond, and can really help empower our advocacy without relying on traditional sources of funding. And now I'll just talk, as I close out here briefly about effectiveness of the work. And I should say that, I haven't run an RCT to see how many chickens we've saved from the work. I do think it would be really valuable for us to put some more resources into trying to quantify the direct impact of the work. But I see this still as being very much an experiment that is still in its early stages. And I personally, am pretty skeptical of a lot of the claims that you can save X number of chickens per dollar. And even though I am, very much an effective altruist, I kind of have different heuristics for thinking about what is the most effective form of advocacy. And I really look forward to everyone grilling me on that and trying to see if you can help sharpen my thinking in this area. But we are, I see this work as really being focused on changing values in our law and in society over the long run. And it is extremely difficult, I think, to quantify the impact of the work that we're doing. While we have had some direct impacts through, as I said before, changing certain business practices, in raising awareness through the media, in developing information from this industry, from the industry, and learning more about the industry, I do have to admit it's very difficult to quantify the impact here, and it's something that I'm really interested in trying to do. But if nothing else, I am happy to say, as I said before, that I think, and I'm not sure if this is right, but I think that even if it was not the most effective thing in the world, the fact that we can actually, again, have this work be funded by its own success in the courts does put it, I think, in a very interesting position to prove to be an effective strategy, and may not necessarily need to compete over the long run for donor dollars with other animal advocacy projects. And with that, I think I'll wrap it up, and I guess just say that this is just one tool in the toolbox, and I think we really do need a multiplicity of approaches to really make the most of our advocacy. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.